Here's a problem where we are given a division problem and we are to rewrite it as a multiplication problem. So to show you the relationship between a division problem and a multiplication problem, let's first remind ourselves of what multiplication was. Multiplication usually took on the form where we give you a number, which represented the number of copies of something, and we multiply by the number of objects in each copy to get some total. So for example, if I told you that I had 4 copies of 3 things, we thought of that as here are 3 things and I am to make 4 copies of those 3 things and then add them all up to find their total. So if I did that, here are 3 units and I took and I made 1, 2, 3, 4 copies of my 3 things, and if you had 4 copies of those 3 things, you would get a total of 12, and you could do this just by counting them all up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Or if you know how to count by threes, 3, 6, 9, 12. So division actually is exactly this, except for rather than giving you the number of copies and the number of objects, we do it a little differently. In fact, if you look at this division problem, it says we want to know what 12 divided by 3 is, and it turns out that the meaning of the 3 and the 12 have the same meaning as the 3 and the 12 over here, meaning we just moved things around a bit so that it looks like this, where we are given the total number of objects. If you want, you can think of that as our goal, and we are told how many items are in each of my copies, and then the answer that you're supposed to find is how many copies of that would it take to make that number. So it's as if they didn't give me the number 4. So in the statement 4 times 3 equals 12, suppose we didn't give you the number 4, and we instead put a question mark there. I guess I should have put this in red. So it turns out that the 3, the question mark, and the 12 have the same meaning in the multiplication statement up here as this division statement. How many copies of 3 objects would it take to make a total of 12? We found that out a minute ago to be 4. What we did is we rewrote this as a division statement and said if the total is 12 things, if we divided that into many groups of 3, how many groups or copies would it take? So the first thing you need to do is take what was given, which is this statement, and you need to rewrite it as a multiplication statement. So think of this as we have a total of 12 things. How many copies of 3 does it take to make up 12? How many 3's are there in 12? So you would rewrite that as how many copies, question mark, of 3 things, so times 3, would it take so that if you took that number of copies times the number of things in each copy, you would get a total of 12 things. So this is the answer to the first statement, and if you want to get that on Math AS, you would hold Shift and then press the number 8 on the keyboard, and that would give you an asterisk, which is the computer's way of thinking of multiplication. Now to actually get the question mark, you would actually have to go through the problem like we did and actually make a group of 3 things, because that's the number of objects in each copy. How many groups of 3 would it take to make 12, or how many 3's are there in 12, if you will? So we figured that out to be that it takes 4 of them, and I use these little dots, which become a little more cumbersome, but you could think of it this way. Instead of thinking of it as how many copies of 3 dots did it take to make 12 dots, you could actually think of it as how many times do you have to add 3, meaning each of these groups of 3 dots would add 3 to my total, and if you added 3 4 times, you end up getting 12. So you can think of all division problems as multiplication problems, and you can ultimately solve them by repeated addition. How many 3's does it take to make 12? Well, it would take 4 3's added together to make 12. So the answer to my question is that there's 4 copies of 3 things, or if you want, 4 copies of the digit 3 added together to make 12. So we would say that the question mark must be 4. 4 times 3 is 12, and 12 divided by 3 is 4. Problem is very similar, except you may notice that it involves a negative number, so our answer will involve a negative number. So it's important that you see in the directions that it says place all negative numbers in parentheses, as was done here. And this problem is going to work just like the last one. 30 divided by negative 6 means that this is the number of units in each group or each copy, and we need to know, question mark, how many copies or how many groups of negative 6, and I forgot my parentheses, would it take to make up 30? So the way that we write this in a multiplication statement is, this is the total amount, and we want to know how many copies of negative 6 it would take to make 30. As a multiplication statement, that always looks like this. The first number is always the number of copies, and in this case, we don't know the number of copies, and we always multiplied that by how many things were in each copy. That's negative 6. And in multiplication, if we knew how many copies and how many things were in each copy and we multiplied, we would get the total, which in this problem, we want the total to be 30. So you can see that the 3 players in this statement are the same as the 3 players in this statement. It's just that they're rearranged and written a different way. The meaning of each of the 3 things is the same, and the meaning of the entire statement is the same. So all division problems can be thought of as multiplication problems. So the first one is actually the easier of the two in this case. 30 divided by negative 6 equals question mark can be written as, how many copies of negative 6 are there in 30? And we usually write the number of copies first, but it doesn't have to be that way. So we don't know how many copies there are, so question mark times how many copies of negative 6 will give me a total of 30 units. To answer this, you could think of this using the chip model, as you have 6 negative chips, and you want to know how many copies of that would it take to make 30 positive chips. And the idea was, because I have to use negative chips, but my ultimate goal is to get 30 positive chips, the method used was to just go with negative chips and then at the end take the opposite of that answer. So even though I have to make 30 positive chips, and I must do this by making several copies of 6 negative chips, the fact that they're opposite in sign only means that when I get my final answer, I will simply take the opposite of that answer. So don't pay attention to the sign at this point. It's just how many copies of this would I have to make to get 30 things. So my first copy of 6 things would give me 6. My second copy of 6 things gives me 12. And if you continued on this pattern and kept counting the number of negative symbols you have total, keeping a running total, you would find that it ends up being that you need 5 copies of 6 things to get 30. And you can kind of see it already over here. I purposely, when I wrote my 30 positive chips, I arranged them in rows of 6 because I was dividing by negative 6. So if you were to count the number of negative chips here I have, there'd be 30. And this is because I need 30 positive chips. So the answer is that you need 5 copies of 6 things, so there would be the number of copies, to make 30. It's just because I am using negative chips and I want positive chips, means that you have to take the opposite of that. So normally the answer would be 5, but since the sign on the numbers, or if you want the kind of chips I'm using, negative instead of positive, are opposite in sign, you must take the opposite of your final answer. So it turns out that 30 divided by negative 6 is negative 5, and then that would mean that negative 5, in parentheses, times negative 6 is equal to 30, so they want you to write negative 5 here. Now you may want to avoid the idea of there being a negative number of copies, because that seems impossible. Think of this as you have 5 copies, but your copies are opposite in sign of what your goal was. If you're having trouble typing your answer in Math AS, watch the end of the video in which I will show how I type one of the answers in a Math AS question. So I'd like to do the last problem in this Math AS question and actually type the answer in and show you how this looks in Math AS. It says rewrite the division problem negative 18 divided by negative 6 equals question mark as a multiplication problem. So this is the original problem here, and it's given as a division problem, and we are to write it as a multiplication problem, and everything remains the same. This is still going to mean that I want the total number of things to be negative 18, or if you want 18 negative chips, and we want to know how many copies or groups of negative 6, or how many copies or groups of 6 negative chips would it take to make negative 18. So the idea is we don't know that. That would be the answer to the question. So like the other ones, it would be how many copies is the question of 6 negative things would it take to get a total of 18 negative things. And if you had this many copies of this many things, you would multiply them to find out that total. So think of this as the number of objects in each group. So if you like the chip model, we have 6 negative chips, and we want to know how many copies of 6 negative chips would it take to make a total of negative 18. And the idea is this would just be one copy, if you will. A second copy and a third copy, it turns out, would be necessary to get 18. So here is, apparently I cannot count, 5 things. So let me put one more. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 negative chips. If I was to make another copy, that would give me 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then finally another copy would give me 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So counting off, continue making copies of 6 groups of negative chips and count up until you get to negative 18. The answer is that we would need 3 copies. The meaning of the 3 here would be the same as the meaning of the 3 here. If you have 3 copies of 6 negative chips, you would have a total of 18 negative chips. Written as a division statement, negative 18 divided into groups of 6 negative chips makes it so that there are 3 copies. Again, this is still the total number of objects. It's sort of like your goal. The answer to the question is how many copies would you have to make? And this is simply how many objects are there in each group. In our case, there were 6 negative chips. So hopefully you see that the 3 things in this statement are the same as the 3 things in this statement, not only in number, but also in concept. They mean the same thing. So my answer is going to be 3, but the Math AS question, if you remember, had me first writing the division problem as a multiplication problem. So I'm on this one, and we wrote it as, the question mark would be the number of copies of negative 6 it would take to make negative 18. And we make this a multiplication problem by holding the shift key on our keyboard and hitting the number 8 to get an asterisk, and the computer will read that as a multiplication symbol. So this would be the number of copies multiplied by the number of things in each copy, which is 6 negative things, or 6 negative chips. But remember, you need to put negative numbers in parentheses, and that would be equal to negative 18. So I will put negative 18 in parentheses. Don't forget they also want to know the value of the question mark, meaning how many copies did it take. And it took 3 copies of 6 negative chips to make 18 negative chips. So when I submit my answer, because I left all the questions blank except for the last 2, I will get them all wrong, but my point is that I did get those 2 parts correct. You can see that by the green box around my answers.